John's summing up of the last presentation is a perfect introduction to my presentation, because I'm exactly trying to make that point, is that design has got many, if you look at different design practices, they overlap, but they don't necessarily share all that much that is in common. And that's why we were thinking is that there's a lot of things we call design, and then we look at them closely and we think, what is actually the design about it? And other things that we don't call design, maybe like the writing that Andy was talking about, that is actually very much like design. So we are pondering this, and we don't have the right answers either, but we thought it's a good way of sharing our current state of confusion, and maybe that's what a lot of academic research is about. And what we felt is that there were fundamentally two different ways of looking at design when we talk about it. Sometimes we talk about design in the sense of everything that is to do with the creation of an artifact has something to do with design. So if we look at something like an aircraft design involves an awful lot of activities, and many of these activities aren't necessarily design activities as such, but they're part of aircraft design, and these are done by very highly trained professionals who often come from very different academic paradigms. We've got material scientists, we've got mathematicians, we've got people who are much more akin to designing in other fields. And then we think of design as a human activity where we have got a sort of underlying common process. This is, I think, what helps us to widen the definitions of design out to all sorts of things that don't necessarily lead to the creation of artifacts that we would think of as being designed. And that's where we get users and amateurs and all sorts of people into design processes who are not professionally trained as designers. And what I'm going to argue in my talk here is that I think design is a family resemblance concept like so many other concepts, and that looking for a definition is probably a hiding to nothing to a certain extent. So I'm going to talk around two examples that I've studied practically at very different ends of what we think of as design. One is the design of a diesel engine, a very mature incremental product, and then sustainable fashion design. And all throughout my career I've studied both engineering design and fashion processes and confused everybody terribly with it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the elusive act of synthesis, which is often what we think of as the essence of design, this creation of something new, something creative. And then I talk about the shifting boundaries of design and about the concept of a family resemblance in design. Now, we've just had a talk about different definitions of design. And what I find very curious is that there has been a lot of work on what is in common between different design domains, and curiously little about how design domains differ, because we've got such a rich phenomenon as design, yet we have got very little understanding of what causes different behavior in different design problems, and what tools, techniques, methods, processes would apply under which circumstances. Because we find that a lot of design research is an abstraction of a particular case that people study. I mean, I studied knitwear design, so I was trying to convince you that that tells all of you something about design in general, and a lot of people didn't quite buy that one. And similarly, other people study architectural design, draw conclusions about all of design, or engineering design, and that's only possible to a limited extent. And then we have got a lot of different theories and perspectives of design that people are talking about from different perspectives that are all extremely illuminating and give us a very rich insight into what design might be. And none of them are wrong, and all of them are missing out some essential parts. We've got design from everything from rational problem solving to reflective practice to mathematical decision decision making. And then we also have got a lot of views of design that come from a particular discipline like sociology or cognitive science, who see things through that lens, and which again is often ignoring some of the other lenses. But we all intuitively know it's that richness that makes up all of design. But what I always found very curious, that if you look at design from a cognitive definition, we often think of design as the sort of classical evolution of analysis, synthesis, evaluation. And the synthesis part is where the new thing is being generated, what we often intuitively think is the creative bit, the generation of something new. But when you start looking at where does design synthesis happens, it becomes a curiously elusive process in industry. So I've done quite a lot of industrial studies over the years. And sometimes you can pinpoint when the synthesis has happened, but pinpointing the moment when it actually happens and what happens is very, very difficult. So in these two case studies in diesel engine design, it's very, very incremental design problem. A lot of the design decisions have been taken centuries or decades ago. And the process has become so structured that people essentially solve a whole bunch of equations. And at the end of the system, architecture has popped out and you think, where has it actually happened? Where was the synthesis? Where is the putting together point of it? And it's quite disappointing that it's difficult to find somebody who is the architect or the person who does the synthesis. And on the other hand, when you study fashion design, people who will swear that they are the creatives and that they're very creative all the time, you realize that they actually also do very little designing themselves, that they spend a lot of time trying to organize their businesses, finding their customers, organizing the production and all sorts of things. And then maybe they spend a couple of hours every year designing something new. So whether they are designers or whether they are creative is then another question. So it becomes really, really elusive. And I think one of the reasons why it's so elusive is that it happens at very many different scales, that design processes share a lot of similarities when you look at them at an abstract level, but then when you look at it in more detail, in small processes like with the fashion designers, the designer has to do everything. And because they have to do everything, they have very little time to actually do any designing, because they have to do the organizing and the production planning and everything. Whereas in the very large scale processes like in engineering design, it's very, very fragmented, that you have got hundreds of people working together doing particular bits. And when you look at those bits and the details of the bits, it becomes quite difficult to say, well, when would I actually think this person is designing? When are they calculating? When are they testing? When are they communicating? When are they reading specifications? And we do have people from many, many different disciplines coming in together, many of whom wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as designers anymore. So when you start looking in engineering companies at the roles of engineers, then some of them are calling themselves designers and many of them don't call themselves designer. This is a list that our co-author Chris McMahon has drawn up, who himself was a diesel engineer in the 1980s. So that's why we are saying draftmen, because they were all draftmen at the time. So no sexism implied here. But what he was saying is that there is a whole range of different roles that I have observed later on in company. We've got people who call themselves designers, but they are often the ones who sort of do the detailed scheme layout, do the CAD work, and are not necessarily the people who are in charge of the overall performance that is the key criteria through which the engines could be sold. That's something that's much more done by the design analysts, who are doing the calculations and who are doing simulations, but they don't actually create things. They just analyze the specifications that other people are giving them. So they're doing stress analysis or thermal analysis or something like that. Then we've also got a whole lot of people who sometimes are called design engineers or component engineers, who are responsible for particular parts, and they are the ones who work in a project and have to communicate and interrelate with each other and make sure that they sort out all of these multiple, very, very elusive interfaces. The design draftsmen in Chris's days are now pretty much automated because they were the people who did actually the technical drawings. And then you've got a lot of people who are development engineers who sort of do tests or advice on parameters and things like that, and they are creating input to other people who then do the designing, but often are very, very knowledgeable. So in all of this ecosystem, it's actually very hard to say who is the designer, who does the designing. And in this diesel engine company I studied, they had a chief architect who used to do the conceptual design of a whole engine round about 2002, 2003, he still did this. And 15 years later, the guy was still in the company, but they designed their engine through this requirements cascade. And his role was to look at all of those little clashes and little problems that people would have, because the boundaries of design are changing so much in engineering to something that is much more mathematical, much more structured, much more simulation based. And essentially these days the role of the system architect was the person who said, well, you're never going to get a spanner in an Arctic glove into that space of the engine. Think about what it means for the user, think about what it means in different circumstances. So a very shifting role of the person we would think of as the designer. But the boundaries are also changing for the fashion designers. As I said, they don't spend an awful lot of time designing, but they also traditionally didn't used to interact with their customers. But now this is changing, and they're working a lot more on understanding customers, educating customers, especially telling them about sustainability related issues. So again, the designers becomes an educator as part of their design role, but still doesn't do any more synthesis than they did before. And I think one of the reasons why we are struggling to define the boundaries with design is what Yoram alluded to earlier, is that we have got this design as a verb, we have got design as a noun, we have got the designer, we've got designing, and but I think what we do have in common is this idea that synthesis is maybe at the heart of designing, this creation of something new. But in professional design, that can be very, very hidden amongst a whole lot of other activities, like understanding the problem, understanding behavior, checking interactions, validating, and then making a move. And I've put this picture of a fuel pump there because I met a very nice lady at Volvo Trucks who is responsible for the coolant pumps for trucks. And she essentially says she spends about an hour every year making a change to the physical CAD system, and the rest is all analysis, trying to figure out this is a cast platform component, it can't be changed. So the amount of things she can actually modify to meet new requirements is incredibly limited. So it's all around the analysis and the understanding of the problem, what design is for her. And I think this one of the reasons why we have got all of these phenomena as designers, I think that design is a family resemblance concept. That's an old concept by Wittgenstein from the mid-1990s, and he's talking about games. And now I show you quite a lot of different games. So we have got sort of something like a board game where we are competing against each other. We've got a football game, we are working physically. We have got something like pick-up sticks where you might work on your own. We have got computer games where we play ourselves, play against a computer, or we have got pretense games. Here my daughter is trying to be a grave effigy, for example. So we've got lots and lots of different ways of games. And we can't really pinpoint what a game is, because no two games have the same characteristics, and there are things that we call games that have nothing in common with other things that we call games. But we don't find it problematic because we know what a game is, we handle these things. And I think that's exactly what happens when we have a family resemblance concept. And Wittgenstein says that most concepts are essentially developed and not defined, and that's why they have got these very rich meanings that we can't necessarily pinpoint. And that family resemblance concepts are things where elements are being shared, just like in a family, where one child has got the dad's eyes and the mother's nose, and the other one has got the grandfather's mouth and things like that. And we look at them together and think, yeah, we can see that they're family, they all look like each other. But when you put two siblings next to each other, sometimes we wouldn't recognize them as looking similar. And it's the same thing with these family resemblance concepts. And they all have got fuzzy boundaries, and we've talked about the fuzzy boundaries of design before. And we learn its meaning through looking at the exemplars rather than through declarative definitions. And what is similar and what is different is very much a matter of definition. Just like when we look at a child and then try to figure out what have they got in common with their parents, people interpret this often very differently. And I think design is exactly in that category. But I think that it has got implications for us as design researchers. That I think we have got many complementary and conflicting definitions, and that's just fine because they are essentially illuminating a rich phenomenon that we don't necessarily need to try to pinpoint. And we do, of course, have a lot of common characteristics on an abstract level. It's just the question what happens at the extreme points, and does it matter? So if you, for example, look at the differences between the design of a toothbrush and a helicopter, there isn't a vast amount, but is that really a problem in practice? And we set very much emphasis for rhetorical purposes of what is design. In some cases you want to emphasize the design because creativity is considered to be cool. In other circumstances you want to play it down because it maybe includes risk or variability or whatever it happens to be. But I think we have to be careful because the term design maybe shouldn't be owned or isn't owned by any particular group. And we generate as design researchers a lot of these abstractions, but the question is, what's the use of these abstractions? And I think that's very much one of my favorite quotes by Brian Lawson that said, knowing that design consists of analysis, synthesis, and evaluation will no more enable you to design than knowing the movements of a breaststroke will prevent you from sinking in a swimming pool. So I think what's the point in working out all of those definitions? What designers in practice want is description on a sort of meso level, not something that is terribly, terribly detailed, but also not something that's abstract. It's something that's tailored enough to them that they can actually get something actionable out of it. And that's where design gets very, very tricky, designing processes at an appropriate level of abstraction that they have got meaning, but yet not too detailed that you get yourself lost into the detail. And what I think designers are interested in is really what they can learn from practice at whatever level of detail this happens to be. So maybe this absolute quest for the abstract definition is not necessarily what we need. So I think in conclusion we would say there is no one definition of design, and there can't be one, and many statements of design just apply to one domain, and that's just fine. And that's very much a matter of drawing the boundaries and pushing an agenda. So there's a lot of political agenda making around what is included into design, but I think we need to really focus on embracing and learning about the differences so that we can start thinking systematically about how we can transfer knowledge from one design field to another and really benefit from the strengths and weaknesses of particular aspects of design. And I think we also should study a very broad range of design activities and trying to understand these differences between design where we can learn from each other.